Welcome back to the introduction to Luke. So last week we just did a bit of an overall sort of summary of what the book of Luke was. Remember, Matthew was a Jew writing to the Jewish audience about the outcast. Mark was a Jewish author writing to the Romans about the strength and the power that Jesus is more powerful. And then we've talked about Luke, who is most likely a Jewish convert who is writing to the friends of God. And we've decided it was written in 4 parts, and we are up to part 1, the introduction, which is Luke chapter 1 and 2, if you're following along with your reading plans. And that is all about, the angel Gabriel showing up to Elizabeth. Hey, John the Baptist is coming along, coming up to Zechariah, and prophesying that John the Baptist would be born, and then showing up to Mary and prophesying the birth of Jesus. It's really quite interesting when we're looking at, especially the John the Baptist side of things. When we're looking at Zechariah and Elizabeth, it's a very clear connection to Abraham and Sarah. You've got the barren wife, and you've got the angel shows up, and even Hannah with the birth of Samuel. There's these very clear ties of John 1 and 2 back to the Old Testament prophecies, the messianic prophecies. There's a very clear that Luke is letting us know exactly what is going on. It's not even subtle. I love it when in Luke 1 it says this, that John the Baptist was going to be a forerunner before Jesus in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children and the disobedient to the attitude of the righteous, so as to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. So again, we've got this very clear messianic prophetic fulfillment that Luke is really going after. He's got 2 straight chapters that are really nailing that this is who John and Jesus are. In amongst this, we've got a couple of poems, again, just to reiterate again and again. It's called Mary's Magnificat, something like that. I'm not Catholic, unfortunately. I think it's a Catholic thing. But just that poem of Mary's, which is just absolutely littered with Old Testament prophetic language. And then you've got Zechariah's Benedictus, I think it's called. And again, just this really, Luke really hammering, this is who John, this is who Jesus is. So a couple of things that I think are really worth pointing out as we're looking in it. And let's just jump straight to the birth of Jesus. A couple of things that I think are really, really interesting for us. Number 1, Mary and Joseph, they have to go back to Joseph's hometown in order to do the census. But isn't it interesting that there was nowhere for them to stay? And so they had to just go to the barn or whatever, they were talking about. It's not really that, but let's just go with that for now. If they're going to Joseph's hometown, who lives in Joseph's hometown? Joseph's family. And yet his family, the Israelites, the Middle East, they are renowned for their incredible hospitality. And yet Joseph and Mary could not find any family members in order to which they could stay, even though Mary was very, very pregnant in the situation. It doesn't really tell us why, but I could only imagine that there must have been an element of shame attached to it. Mary was claiming, and scripture tells us, we call it the virgin birth, and again, they may have been around a couple of thousand years ago, but they knew how babies were born. And so that this kind of shows that Joseph, despite that when Jesus was born, he wasn't born again into a palace. He was born into this space of shame. He was born into this space of, not a palace, but of a barn with animals in it. This upside down kingdom. And I think this right from the very beginning, Luke is letting us know that his kingdom is very different than what anybody expected. That theme sort of continues on. I mean, first of all, the angels show up to shepherds, and shepherds were regarded as lowly. But I love the message. Every Christmas, I just want to preach on this one verse. I just love it. The angels show up and say that they bring a message of good news, of great joy for all people. Not just for the Jewish people, for all people. That the message of Jesus is good news of great joy for all people. And as I like to say, if the message of Jesus or the gospel message that you have heard is not good news of great joy for all people, then you've got the wrong gospel. But again, it looks differently than what everybody was expecting. Then after the birth of Jesus, and we've got more prophetic stuff with Simeon and things going on, but after the birth of Jesus, there's this really curious part where Jesus is 12 years old, and they're at a family gathering at Jerusalem, and they're on their way home, and Jesus goes missing, and then a few days later they're like, oh, Jesus is missing, and they find him at the temple. I think this is really, really fascinating, because it says that the rabbis or the leaders at the synagogue were fascinated by the questions that Jesus asked. That's really incredible, because we don't really hear from Jesus again after this until he's about 30. One of the reasons which I love, which I've got from Shane Willard, which really makes a lot of sense to me, is that basically what happens is at the age of 12, people get, people get instructed, if they're going to be a rabbi, that's when they would start their rabbi training. And how do they start their rabbi training? But because a rabbi will choose a student who asks really great questions. And it takes 18 years to become a rabbi, and that is fulfilled in his baptism in Luke chapter 4. But I just think it's really incredible that this idea that Jesus was just renowned for asking questions. He was found at the temple, and most likely because he was becoming a rabbi. But not just a rabbi. There were two different types of rabbis. One was a rabbi, full stop, and the other one was a rabbi who had authority. And we know that in the scriptures it says, hey, he preaches like one who has authority. That doesn't mean he was shouting and angry. It means that he was a rabbi with authority. The authority to do what? Well, only rabbis with authority could interpret scripture the way they wanted to, that they could sort of see scripture to be interpreted. If you didn't have that authority, you only had the authority to teach the scriptures as your rabbi taught you. You had the authority to summarize the scriptures. It was called a rabbi's yoke, and we know that Jesus' burden is light and his yoke is easy. And what is his yoke? Well, how does he summarize scriptures? Well, we can find two places where he summarized the scriptures, very, very similar. The first one is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Do this and you fulfill the law and the prophets. And also treat people the way you'd want to be treated if you were them. If you do that, you fulfill the law and the prophets. So that would be Jesus' yoke. So if we bring it all the way back when he was 12, asking great questions, that was essentially Jesus's audition or interview into becoming a rabbi. And I love it. It's the last Acts 2:42, I think, 2:52. I think it's Acts 2:52. It says, and Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature with God and with man. And I think that's a great place to leave it right there. So maybe some questions just to leave us with might be, number one, is your gospel message, is the Jesus you believe in, is the fact that Jesus came good news of great joy for all people? Maybe another question you might be able to ask, if the kingdom of heaven is coming in a way that doesn't really look like what we think it should, maybe we need to go back. Do we need to go back and have a look at what the kingdom of heaven is? Are we living in the kingdom of heaven, or are we living in the one that we think it should be? And then maybe a third question we could ask is, are we preaching scripture? Are we interpreting scripture the way our rabbi has? We don't have authority, only Jesus had the authority to do that. So we don't have the authority to interpret scripture any way we like. We are only authorized to preach and teach scripture the way that Jesus has taught us, the way that Jesus interprets us. And I reckon that's a really challenging question as well, because this is a big part of why we're doing what we're doing. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is trying to understand who Jesus is, how he interpreted scripture, how he saw the world, how he saw us, and what our place in it looks like. So with that being said, we have done the introduction, chapter 1 and 2. See you next week.